It was supposed to be the perfect beginning. The house in Mourne Heights, nestled in the heart of the upmarket side of the seaside town of Newcastle, Northern Ireland, was everything Claire and Sean had ever dreamed of. A fresh start, a symbol of their new life together. But on the night of their housewarming party, a chance encounter with an old neighbor would uncover a secret so dark it would threaten not only their marriage but the reputation of the entire community. The Victorian-era home stood proudly at the end of Slieve Donard Avenue, its grey stone facade and bay windows offering commanding views of both the Irish Sea and the mountains that gave the neighborhood its name. Claire Donovan, newly Claire Murphy, stood in her kitchen, adjusting a platter of canapés for their housewarming party, occasionally stealing glances out the window. The sunset cast the Mourne Mountains in a purple haze, the gentle slope of Slieve Donard looking like something out of a fairy tale. 6 months of marriage, and now this, a home in the most prestigious address in County Down. Sometimes Claire had to pinch herself to believe it was real. Need any help with those? Sean slipped his arms around her waist from behind, planting a kiss on her neck. At 34, he still possessed the boyish charm that had swept her off her feet 2 years ago, though his dark hair now showed hints of silver at the temples. "I'm fine," Claire said, leaning back into his embrace. "Are you ready for tonight? Meeting the entire neighborhood at once?" "I grew up around these parts," Sean reminded her with a smile. "Not in Mourne Heights itself, mind you, but I've glad-handed with enough of Newcastle's elite to know the ropes." Claire turned to face him, her fingers adjusting his tie. "You never really talk about your childhood here." Something flickered across Sean's features, so brief Claire almost missed it. "Nothing much to tell. Ordinary life, ordinary family. Until I moved to Dublin for university, met you, and life became extraordinary." He winked, and Claire laughed, brushing aside the slight unease she felt. "Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, I presume?" Their housekeeper, Mrs. Flynn, swept into the kitchen with fresh towels. "The caterers are setting up in the dining room, and the first guests will be arriving in 30 minutes. "Thank you, Mrs. Flynn. And please, call me Claire," she reminded the older woman for perhaps the 10th time. The formality of having household staff was something Claire was still adjusting to. Growing up in a modest home in suburban Dublin, she'd never imagined she'd one day be hosting soirees for Northern Ireland's elite. By 7:30, the house hummed with the elegant cacophony of a successful party. Ice clinked in crystal glasses, classical music drifted from hidden speakers, and laughter punctuated conversations throughout the first floor. Claire circulated among her guests with practiced ease, though inside she felt like an imposter. These people, judges, surgeons, business magnates, had inherited their positions in society, while she and Sean had clawed their way up. "You've done wonders with the place," purred Amelia Wilson, wife of the region's most prominent barrister. "When the Stevensons lived here, it was all dark wood and hunting trophies. So dreary." "Thank you," Claire replied, sipping her champagne. "Though we haven't changed much structurally yet. Those plans are still with the architect. Well, it's refreshing to see new blood in the neighborhood," Amelia continued. "Some of these families have been here before Victoria was on the throne. Gets a bit stale, if you know what I mean." Claire nodded politely, watching Sean across the room, deep in conversation with 2 older gentlemen. He belonged here in a way she didn't yet, laughing at inside jokes, referencing local landmarks with the ease of familiarity. She excused herself from Amelia and made her way to the kitchen for a moment of solitude. The caterers had transformed the space into a bustling command center. Claire slipped past them to the butler's pantry, where she could catch her breath. That's when she noticed the woman standing by the window, staring out at the gardens with a glass of red wine in her hand. She was perhaps in her late 50s, slender and elegant in a midnight blue dress that seemed a decade out of fashion but somehow timeless. Her silver hair was swept into a chignon that accentuated high cheekbones and eyes that Claire immediately recognized as shrewd and observant. "I hope you don't mind," the woman said without turning. "The noise gets to be a bit much after a while." "I needed a moment." "Not at all," Claire replied, moving to stand beside her. "I was seeking the same thing." The woman turned then, studying Claire with such intensity that she felt momentarily exposed, as though this stranger could see through the careful facade she'd constructed for the evening. "Margaret Byrne," the woman said finally, extending her hand. "I live in the stone house at the end of the lane. Been here 40 years now." "Claire Murphy. It's lovely to meet you, Margaret. Murphy now, is it?" Margaret's mouth curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're Sean's new wife? The art specialist from Dublin?" "Conservator, yes," Claire confirmed, intrigued that this woman knew of her. "Have you known Sean long?" Something flickered across Margaret's face, caution perhaps, or calculation. "I knew his family. Years ago, before they moved away. Newcastle is smaller than it seems, despite all these fancy new developments." Claire was about to press further when Margaret suddenly took her arm, leading her deeper into the pantry, away from the kitchen staff. "Be careful, love," Margaret whispered, a knowing look in her eyes. "There are things in this neighborhood that no one talks about. Things people want buried." Claire, trying to shake off the chill creeping up her spine, laughed it off. "What do you mean?" she asked, half joking. But Margaret's face was dead serious. "Trust me, people here hide their sins well, and one day they'll come back to haunt you." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Claire had taken a 3-month leave from the National Gallery to oversee the house renovations and settle into Newcastle. While Sean commuted to his private practice in Belfast, Claire spent her days with contractors, interior designers, and landscapers, transforming the already beautiful house into something truly their own. Yet despite the steady progress, Claire couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her since the housewarming party. Margaret Byrne had not returned any of Claire's neighborly overtures. A delivered basket of muffins had received only a polite thank-you note. And twice Claire had spotted the older woman walking along the stone walls that bordered their properties, only to have Margaret change direction when she noticed Claire watching. It was on a rainy Tuesday, with Sean in Belfast and the contractors driven away by the weather, that Claire finally ventured into the attic. The previous owners had left behind several trunks and boxes they deemed part of the house's history, and Claire was curious to see if any of the items might be incorporated into their redesign. The attic ran the length of the house, with dormers looking out toward both the sea and the mountains. Rain drummed steadily on the roof as Claire picked her way through the space, shining her phone's flashlight across dust-covered shapes. Most were predictable: old furniture, holiday decorations, sporting equipment from decades past. At the far end, beneath the eaves, stood 3 leather trunks with brass fittings. Claire knelt beside the first, running her fingers over the embossed initial S. Inside were university textbooks, sporting trophies, and neatly folded school uniforms, relics of the previous owner's son, she assumed. The second trunk contained women's items, silk scarves, vintage handbags, a jewelry box with costume pieces. But it was the third trunk that caught Claire's attention. Unlike the others, it bore no initial, and the lock had been broken, hanging uselessly from its hasp. Inside, Claire found a jumble of papers, photographs, and small keepsakes. As she sifted through them, she realized they weren't organized by person, but seemingly by location, each bundle labeled with place names she recognized from around Newcastle and the surrounding area. One packet labeled Tollymore Forest contained photographs of people picnicking among the famous redwoods. Another marked Merlot Bay held postcards and pressed flowers. But it was the packet labeled Blackwater House that made Claire pause. She opened the packet carefully, spreading its contents on the dusty floorboards. Black and white photographs showed the mansion in its glory days, a stunning Victorian Gothic structure with manicured gardens and a stone bridge spanning a small lake. Color photos from later decades documented the property's gradual decline. Claire was about to replace everything when a particular photograph caught her eye. It showed Blackwater House perhaps 20 years ago, still elegant though beginning to show neglect. But it wasn't the house that made Claire's breath catch. It was the couple standing on its front steps. The young man was unmistakably Sean, perhaps in his early 20s, his face thinner but with the same distinctive smile. Beside him stood a young woman with flowing dark hair, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. They were dressed formally, as though attending a summer party. Claire turned the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "The love we shared, even if we never spoke of it again." Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed the photo aside and continued looking through the packet. There were more pictures of Sean at Blackwater House, sometimes with the same dark-haired woman, sometimes with a group of young people. One showed him standing with an older couple on the mansion's terrace, all dressed in formal wear, champagne flutes in hand. At the bottom of the packet, Claire found several newspaper clippings. The first, dated 15 years ago, announced Blackwater House sold as Callahan family relocates to America. Another from 2 years later read, "Historic Blackwater estate falls into dispute as owners vanish, taxes unpaid." Claire sat back on her heels, puzzled. Sean had never mentioned any connection to Blackwater House or a family named Callahan. And who was the dark-haired woman? A college girlfriend, perhaps? But that wouldn't explain why these photographs were hidden away in their attic, in a house Sean had claimed to have no previous connection to. As she moved to replace the contents, Claire's hand bumped against something beneath the attic floorboards. Curious, she pressed down and felt a board shift. Using a letter opener from the trunk, she pried up the loose plank, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay a single box about the size of a hardcover book. Unlike the dusty trunks, this box seemed relatively clean, as though it had been placed there more recently. Claire lifted it out, her heart suddenly racing. The box contained more photographs, these more personal. Sean and the dark-haired woman in intimate moments. Walking on the beach, her head on his shoulder. Laughing together in what looked like a university pub, and one that made Claire's stomach tighten. The woman smiling at the camera, a diamond ring prominently displayed on her left hand. Beneath the photos lay a small stack of letters, bound with a faded ribbon. Claire hesitated, a voice in her head warning that she was crossing a line. These were Sean's private memories, perhaps from before they'd even met. Yet something about the hidden nature of these mementos, secreted beneath the floorboards of the attic, seemed deliberate. Not like treasured keepsakes one simply hadn't mentioned, but like secrets intentionally concealed. With trembling fingers, Claire untied the ribbon. The letters were addressed to Sean Murphy, but at an address in Belfast she didn't recognize. The return address read, Eliza Callahan, Blackwater House, Newcastle. Claire unfolded the first letter, dated almost 15 years ago. My dearest Sean, these past days without you have been unbearable. Father continues to insist I accompany the family to Boston, but I cannot imagine a life across an ocean from you. I've told him about our engagement, perhaps not wise given the history between our families, but I could keep it secret no longer. His reaction was worse than I feared. He called you that Murphy boy with such venom, as though your family name alone were poison. When I defended you, spoke of your medical studies and our plans, he laughed that cruel laugh I've come to dread. The Murphys can change their clothes and their accents, he said, but they cannot change what they are or what they've done. I don't understand this ancient grudge, Sean. What happened between our families that creates such hatred? Whatever it is, we can overcome it together. Meet me at our place in the woods on Saturday. We'll make our plans to leave, together, as we promised. Boston, Belfast, or Timbuktu. I don't care where we go, as long as we're together. All my love, Eliza. Claire's heart pounded as she read the remaining letters. The second, dated a week later, revealed Eliza's growing desperation. Sean, you didn't come. I waited by the willow tree for 3 hours, soaked through from the rain. Have they gotten to you too? Has someone told you lies about me, about my feelings? Father says we're leaving for Boston in 2 days. He set most of the household staff ahead already. Please, if you get this, come to me. We can still escape this madness together. Forever yours. The final letter in the stack was different. Written on hotel stationery from Boston, dated 6 months later. Sean, it's taken me these months to understand what happened, to accept that our love wasn't strong enough to overcome the poison between our families. Perhaps you never truly loved me. Perhaps everything you said was part of your family's revenge. I won't write again after this. Mother and father have arranged a suitable match for me here, a man from another Irish family, with proper connections. I'll do my duty, as you've clearly done yours. But I want you to know this. Whatever happened between our families in the past, whatever wrongs were committed, I loved you purely. And somewhere in Blackwater House, buried where only we knew to look, is the proof of what truly happened all those years ago. The truth your family has run from, and mine has used to destroy them. May it haunt you as you've haunted me. Claire carefully refolded the letters, her mind racing. Sean had not only had a previous engagement he'd never disclosed, he appeared to be entangled in some kind of family feud that had deep roots in Newcastle. A feud somehow connected to Blackwater House, the abandoned mansion visible from their bedroom window. And most disturbing, what had happened to Eliza Callahan. The newspaper clipping mentioned the family vanishing and taxes going unpaid. Had they truly relocated to America as planned? And who was the suitable match? Eliza mentioned, "I don't care about the rain damage. The north wing ceiling needs to be reinforced before the first frost, or we'll have a bigger problem come January." Claire stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear as she argued with the contractor. Through the window, she could see the gardener trimming the hedges that separated their property from Margaret Burns' land. It had been 3 days since her discovery in the attic, and Claire had spent them in a state of carefully concealed turmoil. By day, she maintained the facade of the happy newlywed settling into her dream home. She directed renovations, consulted with decorators, and explored the village with apparent enthusiasm. But each night after Sean fell asleep, Claire would lie awake formulating theories about his past with Eliza Callahan. Several times she'd nearly confronted him directly, but something held her back. Perhaps the same instinct that had prompted Margaret Burns' cryptic warning. People here hide their sins well. Having hung up with the contractor, Claire poured herself a cup of tea and watched the gardener work his way along the boundary hedge. Beyond it lay Margaret's property, a smaller but elegant stone house surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. Claire had tried twice more to visit her elusive neighbor, only to be told by Margaret's housekeeper that Ms. Byrne isn't receiving visitors this week. As Claire contemplated her next move, she noticed something unusual. Margaret herself had emerged from her greenhouse and was speaking with the gardener across the hedge. This was her chance. Grabbing a jacket against the light drizzle, Claire hurried outside and across the lawn. "Margaret," she called, waving casually as though this encounter were purely coincidental. "How lovely to see you." Margaret turned, her expression guarded. She wore gardening gloves and carried shears, though she didn't look like she'd been doing much cutting. "Mrs. Murphy," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "How are you settling in?" "Wonderfully, thank you." Claire approached the hedge, nodding to the gardener who discreetly moved further down the boundary to give them privacy. "Though I must admit I've been curious about something you said at our party." Margaret's posture stiffened. "Did I say something memorable? I'm usually quite forgettable at social gatherings." "You mentioned things in this neighborhood that people want buried?" Claire said, keeping her voice light despite the seriousness of the topic. "It's been bothering me, to be honest." Margaret studied Claire for a long moment, her gray eyes sharp and assessing. Finally, she sighed. "Walk with me," she said, gesturing toward a small gate in the hedge that Claire hadn't noticed before. "My roses are blooming, despite this wretched weather. You might appreciate them." Margaret led Claire through immaculate gardens to a small pergola, where they sat protected from the light rain. The older woman examined Claire with calculating eyes. "What exactly are you asking me about?" Margaret finally said. Claire decided on directness. "I found photographs in our attic. Sean with a woman named Eliza Callahan at Blackwater House. He's never mentioned her to me, but from what I found, they were engaged." If Margaret was surprised by Claire's discovery, she didn't show it. "And you want me to fill in the blanks?" "I want to understand why my husband has hidden his past from me, why he pretended not to know Blackwater House when I mentioned it. And I think you know more than you're saying." Margaret removed her gardening gloves deliberately, folding them with precision. "What makes you think I know anything about Sean Murphy's past? You knew who I was at the party. You knew about my work, and you warned me about buried secrets in a way that felt very specific, not general." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. "Perceptive. Yes, I knew Sean, or of him, years ago. Anyone who lived in Newcastle during that time would remember when Eliza Callahan vanished. Claire's heart skipped. Vanished? The newspaper said the family moved to America. That's the official story, Margaret agreed. The Callahans were one of the oldest families in the county, shipping magnates who built Blackwater House in the 1880s. Very prominent, very respected. Their sudden departure caused quite the stir. But you don't believe they went to America? Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I believe Richard and Helena Callahan went to America. Their daughter's whereabouts became less certain. A chill ran through Claire despite the shelter of the pergola. What do you mean? Eliza and Sean were quite the item around town that summer. Both from prominent families, though the Murphys were new money compared to the Callahans. Sean was studying medicine in Belfast, but home for the holidays. Eliza had just finished at some finishing school in Switzerland. Margaret paused, looking past Claire toward Blackwater House, visible through the trees. Their engagement was never formally announced, but rumors spread quickly in a place like this. And then, Claire prompted when Margaret fell silent. Then everything fell apart. There was some sort of confrontation between Sean's father and Richard Callahan at the Newcastle Golf Club. Very public, very ugly. Something about old business dealings. Within a week, the Callahans had left for Boston, supposedly all of them, including Eliza. But you don't think Eliza went with them? Margaret's gaze returned to Claire, sharp and assessing. Two people claim to have seen Eliza in Newcastle after her parents left, a shopkeeper in the village and a housekeeper who worked for the family. Both said she looked distressed, arguing with someone in a car near Blackwater House. And then, nothing. No one saw her again. Claire's mind raced, connecting this information with the letters she'd found. Did the police investigate? Officially, no. Richard Callahan sent word from Boston that his daughter was with them, adjusting to American life. Case closed. Margaret leaned closer, but there were questions, whispers. Why did they leave so suddenly? Why did they abandon Blackwater House without selling it properly? And why did Sean Murphy leave Newcastle the very same week? Not to return until now with you. Claire felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Sean had never mentioned leaving Newcastle under such circumstances. He'd spoken of his medical training in Belfast, his residency in Dublin, but never about fleeing his hometown amid scandal. What happened between the Murphy and Callahan families? She asked quietly. Margaret sighed heavily. That's where history becomes murky. The feud dates back to the 1920s. Something about betrayal during the Troubles, business partnerships dissolved, accusations of theft. By the time I came to Newcastle, it was ancient history to most, but Richard Callahan and Daniel Murphy, Sean's father, kept it alive. They despised each other. And where is Sean's family now? His parents moved to Spain after Daniel retired. The family construction business was sold off in pieces. Sean was their only child, the hope for rehabilitating the Murphy name in Newcastle society. Margaret's mouth twisted in a wry smile. And here he is, back again with a new wife and the finest house on Mourne Heights. Quite the return. Blackwater House stood sentinel against the afternoon sky, its grey stone darkened by generations of Irish weather. Claire approached on foot, having walked the half-mile from their home through woodland that separated the properties. Iron gates hung askew on stone pillars at the entrance to the drive, no longer keeping anyone in or out. The house itself was imposing, even in decay. 3 stories of Gothic Revival architecture with pointed arches, decorative stonework, and a distinctive tower at one corner. Nature had begun to reclaim the grounds. Ivy climbed the walls, and saplings pushed through what had once been manicured lawns. Claire hesitated at the foot of the stone steps leading to the main entrance. What exactly was she hoping to find here? Evidence of Eliza's fate? Some explanation for Sean's secrecy? Or was she simply trying to understand the pull this place seemed to exert over her husband, enough to bring him back to a town he'd fled years ago? The front door was secured with a heavy padlock, but a window to its right had been broken. The boards placed over it pulled loose on one side. Claire glanced around. The property was isolated enough that no one would see her enter, then carefully pushed the boards aside and climbed through. The entrance hall was cavernous, dust motes dancing in shafts of light that penetrated the broken windows. A grand staircase curved upward, its banisters still elegant despite years of neglect. Expensive furniture remained in place, covered in sheets that had once been white, but now bore the gray patina of abandonment. Claire moved slowly through the ground floor, her footsteps echoing on marble tiles. The drawing room featured a magnificent fireplace with carved stone depicting hunting scenes. The dining room still held a massive table that could seat 20, chairs arranged as though expecting dinner guests at any moment. It was in the library that Claire found the first sign that someone else had been visiting. Unlike the other rooms, there was a clear path through the dust on the floor, and one of the reading chairs had been uncovered, the sheet folded neatly beside it. On a small table lay a book, Yeats' collected poems, open to The Wild Swans at Cool. Claire touched the pages gently. They were free of dust, suggesting recent handling. Someone had been here, reading poetry in an abandoned mansion. Was it Sean? The thought made her stomach tighten. Claire continued upstairs, following the grand staircase to the second floor. Here were bedrooms, a master suite with connecting dressing rooms, guest chambers, and what appeared to be Eliza's room. Claire recognized it from photographs she'd seen in the attic. The distinctive wallpaper, faded now, but once a vibrant pattern of birds and cherry blossoms, matched the background of several pictures. Unlike the other bedrooms, this one showed signs of hasty departure. The wardrobe doors stood open, empty hangers jumbled inside. Drawers in the vanity had been pulled out and not fully closed, revealing fragments of a young woman's life. A hairbrush with strands of dark hair still entwined in its bristles, an empty perfume bottle, a silk scarf abandoned in haste. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph of Eliza and Sean, similar to the one Claire had found in the attic. They looked happy, unaware of whatever storm was brewing between their families. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, dust rising around her. She tried to imagine Eliza here, preparing to flee with Sean, waiting for him at their meeting place in the rain. What had happened to prevent their escape? Why had Sean abandoned their plans? A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Claire froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't alone in the house. Carefully, she rose and moved toward the doorway, pressing herself against the wall beside it. The footsteps were deliberate, moving slowly along the corridor toward Eliza's room. Her mind raced through possibilities. Sean? But he was at the hospital in Belfast. Margaret? She'd seemed reluctant to discuss Blackwater House further. A caretaker? But the property had clearly been neglected for years. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Claire held her breath, acutely aware of her vulnerability. She'd told no one where she was going. "I know someone's in there," a man's voice called, unfamiliar and tinged with a local accent. "Show yourself before I call the police." Realizing she had little choice, Claire stepped into the doorway. The man standing in the hallway was perhaps 60, sturdy and weathered, wearing the practical clothing of someone who worked outdoors. He carried a walking stick that he gripped tightly when she appeared. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This is private property." "I'm Claire Murphy," she replied, deciding honesty was her best option. "I live in the house on Sleve Donard Avenue. I was just exploring." The man's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex. "Murphy? You're Sean Murphy's wife?" Claire nodded, studying him more carefully now. There was something familiar about his features, though she was certain they'd never met. The man lowered his walking stick slightly. "Callahan," he said gruffly. "James Callahan. This was my brother's house." Claire couldn't hide her surprise. "Richard Callahan? Eliza's father? I thought the family moved to America." "Richard and Helena did," James confirmed, his tone bitter. "Left everything behind, including their responsibilities." "And Eliza?" Claire asked, watching him closely. "Did she go with them?" Something flashed in James Callahan's eyes. Grief, perhaps, or anger. "That's what they claim, though I've never believed it." Claire took a chance. "Mr. Callahan, I found some things in our attic. Photographs and letters suggesting Sean and Eliza were engaged. I'm trying to understand what happened." James Callahan stared at her for a long moment, then gestured toward the stairs. "Not here. The walls of this house have heard enough secrets. Come with me." He led her downstairs and through the library to a small study at the back of the house. Unlike the other rooms, this one showed signs of recent use. The furniture uncovered, the desk clear of dust, a kerosene lamp standing ready beside a comfortable chair. "You've been coming here," Claire realized aloud. "You were reading Yeats in the library." James nodded, lighting the lamp against the gathering afternoon shadows. "I come once a week or so. Someone should remember what this place was, even as it crumbles." He gestured for Claire to sit in one of the leather armchairs, then took the seat behind the desk. "So Sean Murphy is back in Newcastle," he said, the name laden with complicated emotions, "and married to a woman who knows nothing of his past here. That seems convenient." "I assure you, there was nothing calculated about our meeting or marriage," Claire said firmly. "But yes, I'm learning that my husband has kept significant parts of his history from me. I'd like to understand why." James studied her, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "What do you know about the history between our families?" "Very little. Something about business dealings gone wrong in the 1920s, a feud that Sean's father and your brother kept alive." James gave a humorless laugh. "That's the glossy version. The truth is uglier and more recent." He opened a drawer in the desk and removed a small silver flask, taking a quick drink before continuing. "The Murphys and Callahans were business partners once, building half the grand homes in County Down. After the partition of Ireland, the partnership fractured, political differences, accusations of betrayal. Standard troubles for the time. But that was a century ago," Claire pointed out. "Indeed, and it might have remained ancient history if my brother Richard hadn't discovered what Daniel Murphy, Sean's father, was doing with the family construction business." Scene 14. The truth about Daniel Murphy, Claire leaned forward. "Which was?" "Laundering money for paramilitary groups," James said bluntly. "This was the early 2000s, post-Good Friday Agreement, when most combatants were laying down arms. But some splinter groups continued operating, and they needed legitimate businesses to wash their funds." Claire struggled to process this information. "Sean's father, a criminal? Did Sean know about this?" James shrugged. "He was in university then, focused on becoming a doctor. I'd like to think he was ignorant, but—" He trailed off, letting Claire draw her own conclusions. "What happened when your brother discovered this?" "Richard threatened to expose Daniel. There was a confrontation at the golf club. Very public, very nasty. Richard had evidence, he said, proof that could send Daniel to prison for decades." James stared into the middle distance, remembering. The next day, Blackwater House was broken into. Richard's office was ransacked, but nothing appeared stolen. 2 days later, the Callahans announced they were moving to America immediately. Family emergency, they claimed. "And Eliza?" Claire pressed. James's expression darkened. "Officially, she went with them. Richard has maintained that story for 15 years. That Eliza is happily married to a banker in Boston, with 3 children and a house on Beacon Hill." "But you don't believe it." "I know my niece," James said firmly. "She was madly in love with Sean Murphy. Despite the family objections, she would never have abandoned him without saying goodbye. And she would never have gone 15 years without contacting me, her favorite uncle." Claire remembered the letters she'd found. "In the last communication I found from Eliza, she mentioned waiting for Sean in the rain by a willow tree. She said he never came." James nodded grimly. "There's a willow near the lake at the back of the property. It was their meeting place. According to the housekeeper, Eliza packed a suitcase that week. Clothes, jewelry, personal items. She told the staff she was going away for a while. I believe she and Sean planned to elope." Scene 15. James's suspicions. "But Sean didn't show up," Claire murmured, picturing the scene. Eliza waiting in the rain, gradually realizing she'd been abandoned. "Sean left Newcastle the same day the Callahans departed for Boston," James said. "No goodbyes, no explanations. His parents claimed he'd received an early acceptance to a medical program in Dublin. Very sudden, very convenient. The implications hung in the air between them." Claire forced herself to voice the question. "Do you think Sean was involved in Eliza's disappearance?" James stood, moving to the window that overlooked what had once been formal gardens. "I don't know," he admitted. "For years I suspected the worst. That Daniel Murphy had ensured Eliza couldn't testify against him, and that Sean had either helped or fled to avoid involvement. That's a serious accusation, Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. Yes, it is, James agreed, turning back to her. And I've never had proof, only questions and coincidences. Richard insists Eliza is alive and well in America, though he's never allowed me to speak with her directly. Always excuses. She's traveling, she's busy with the children, she'll call next week. Claire's mind was spinning. If James Callahan's suspicions were correct, she had married a man involved in a young woman's disappearance, possibly her death. But something didn't fit with the Sean she knew. A man who dedicated his life to saving others, who showed such compassion to his patients. Could he really have participated in something so heinous? Mr. Callahan, she said slowly, in Eliza's final letter, she mentioned something buried at Blackwater House, proof of what truly happened all those years ago. Does that mean anything to you? James frowned, clearly surprised by this information. No. Richard never mentioned any evidence hidden here. Where exactly did you find these letters? In our attic, beneath a floorboard. They'd been hidden there deliberately. By Sean, presumably, James said, his tone hardening, which suggests he knows exactly what happened to Eliza and wants to ensure no one else discovers it. The walk back through the woods gave Claire time to think, to try processing everything she'd learned. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. By the time she reached their property, the sun was setting behind the Mourne Mountains, casting a golden glow across the landscape. Sean's car was in the drive. He'd returned earlier than expected. Claire paused at the edge of the garden, suddenly unsure how to proceed. Confront him immediately with what she'd learned? Observe him more carefully, looking for signs of deception? Pretend nothing had happened while she investigated further? Before she could decide, the back door opened and Sean stepped onto the terrace. He wore casual clothes now, a glass of wine in his hand, another waiting on the table beside him. He spotted her immediately. There you are, he called, smiling. I was beginning to worry. Where have you been? Claire walked toward him, hyper-aware of her muddy shoes and the leaves clinging to her jacket from her walk through the woods. Just exploring the neighborhood, she replied, keeping her tone light. Getting to know our surroundings. Sean's smile remained fixed, but something shifted in his eyes. A wariness that hadn't been there before. Find anything interesting? Claire met his gaze steadily. Actually, yes. I had a fascinating conversation with James Callahan at Blackwater House. The glass in Sean's hand stilled halfway to his lips. For a moment, he looked like a man who'd seen a ghost. Or perhaps more accurately, a man who feared his ghosts had finally caught up with him. Claire, he said, slowly, setting down the glass. We need to talk. Sean led Claire into the living room, his earlier plans for a romantic dinner clearly forgotten. He poured them both a larger measure of whiskey than usual and sat opposite her, perched on the edge of the sofa, as though ready to flee. How much did James Callahan tell you? He asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. Enough to know you've been lying to me, Claire replied, watching him closely. About your past in Newcastle, about your engagement to Eliza Callahan, about why you really brought us back here. Sean flinched at Eliza's name. It's not that simple, Claire. Then explain it to me, she demanded, anger finally breaking through her shock. Because right now, I'm sitting across from a stranger. A man who hid an entire part of his life from the woman he married. Sean took a long swallow of whiskey, then set the glass down with deliberate care. I didn't tell you about Eliza because it was painful, and because I was ashamed of how things ended between us. Did you love her? The question slipped out before Claire could stop it. Yes, Sean admitted, not meeting her eyes. Or I thought I did, at 22. We'd grown up in the same circles despite the feud between our families. Forbidden romance has a powerful allure at that age. What happened? Claire pressed. She waited for you by the willow tree in the rain. You never came. Sean looked up sharply. How do you know that? I found her letters in our attic, Claire said. Hidden beneath the floorboards, along with photographs of you two together. Understanding dawned in Sean's eyes. You've known for days. You've been investigating me. Can you blame me? Claire demanded. I married a man who apparently has a connection to a woman who disappeared 15 years ago, a connection he never thought to mention. Eliza didn't disappear, Sean said firmly. She moved to America with her parents. She's married now, living in Boston. So you know where she is? Claire challenged. You've spoken with her since? Sean hesitated. Not directly, but her father confirmed it when I tried to find her a few years after. Claire's suspicions deepened. Sean was hiding something. She could see it in the way he avoided her direct gaze, in the tension of his shoulders. James Callahan says Richard has kept him from speaking directly with Eliza for 15 years. He thinks she never went to Boston at all. James is a grieving uncle looking for someone to blame, Sean said dismissively. He can't accept that Eliza chose to leave everything behind, including me. Why would she do that? Her last letter said she was planning to meet you, to run away together. Sean stood abruptly, moving to the window that faced Blackwater House, silhouetted now against the darkening sky. She changed her mind. My father, he showed her things about my family, about our history. Things that made her realize we could never work. What things? Claire asked, sensing they were approaching the heart of the matter. Sean remained silent for so long, Claire thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. The truth about what happened between our families in 1921. The real reason for the feud that Richard and my father perpetuated. Which was? Sean turned back to her, his expression haunted. Murder, Claire. My great-grandfather killed Eliza's great-grandfather during the Troubles, shot him in the back during a supposed business meeting and took control of their joint holdings. Claire inhaled sharply. That's horrific? Yes. Yes, the Murphys built their fortune on blood money. Sean's mouth twisted bitterly. My father was proud of it, in his twisted way, called it seizing an opportunity when he told me the story. And Eliza didn't know this history until your father told her? Claire struggled to understand the sequence of events. She knew the families had bad blood, but not the specifics, not the deliberate, premeditated nature of it. Sean returned to the sofa, sitting heavily. My father showed her the evidence, his grandfather's journal detailing the murder plan, newspaper clippings about Thomas Callahan's mysterious death. He thought it would end our relationship. And it did, Claire concluded. Sean nodded grimly. She was devastated, not just by what had happened a century ago, but that I'd never told her. That I'd known all along my family's fortune came from her family's destruction. Claire tried to reconcile this with the letters she'd found. But her final letter doesn't mention this. She writes about waiting for you in the rain, about you not showing up, about evidence hidden at Blackwater House that would reveal what truly happened all those years ago. Something flickered in Sean's eyes. Recognition, quickly masked. I don't know what evidence she meant. My father had the only documentation of what happened in 1921. I think you're still lying to me, Claire said quietly. There's more to this story than you're telling. Sean stood again, agitation radiating from him. What do you want from me, Claire? To admit I was a coward? That I let Eliza go because I couldn't face the shame of my family's past? Fine. I admit it. I was young and stupid and afraid. That doesn't explain why you came back to Newcastle, Claire countered. Why buy a house overlooking Blackwater after 15 years away? Why hide your history here from me? Because I needed to face my past. Sean's voice rose in frustration. I've spent 15 years running from what happened here, from who I was then. I thought if I could come back with you, build a new life in the shadow of my old one, I could finally move on. Claire studied her husband, the man she'd fallen in love with in Dublin, whose compassion and dedication had drawn her to him. There was genuine pain in his eyes, real anguish in his voice, but she still sensed omissions in his story. What happened the day the Callahans left for Boston? She asked. James said you left Newcastle the same day. Sean's expression closed. My father sent me away, said it was for my own protection, that Richard Callahan had threatened to destroy our family. Protection from what? I don't know exactly, Sean admitted. My father was involved in things, political things. Richard had discovered something and was threatening to expose him. Money laundering for paramilitaries, Claire stated flatly, watching Sean's reaction. His head snapped up, shock evident. Where did you hear that? From James. He said Richard had evidence that could have sent your father to prison. Sean ran a hand through his hair, seemingly weighing his words carefully. My father was a complicated man, he said finally. After the troubles officially ended, he maintained connections with certain groups. I knew he walked a fine line between legitimate business and other activities, but I tried to stay clear of it. And Eliza's father discovered this? Claire pressed. Yes, he confronted my father at the golf club. It was ugly, public. The next day, our house was broken into, my father's study ransacked. Sean's eyes met hers. 2 days after that, Eliza stopped answering my calls. Her family announced they were moving to America, and my father put me on a plane to Dublin. Claire tried to fit these pieces together. So you never spoke to Eliza again after the break-in? We were supposed to meet that night, by the willow tree. But she never showed up. Sean's fingers tightened around his glass. I assumed her father had intercepted my message somehow, prevented her from coming. When I tried calling Blackwater House, the staff said the family had already left for the airport. This contradicted Eliza's letters, which clearly stated it was Sean who hadn't appeared at their rendezvous. Claire's unease deepened. Someone was lying, Sean or Eliza, or perhaps both of them, and you never questioned this? Claire asked incredulously. You never tried to contact her in America? Of course I did. Sean's voice rose in frustration. For months I called, wrote letters, even contacted mutual friends. Richard Callahan finally called my father, threatening legal action if I didn't stop harassing his daughter. He said Eliza wanted nothing more to do with me or my criminal family. But you never spoke to her directly? No, Sean admitted, deflating slightly. I never heard her voice again after that last call when we arranged to meet. Something about this detail caught Claire's attention. The last time you spoke was when you arranged to meet by the willow tree? The meeting she says you missed? Sean nodded. We talked around midnight. My father was out, and I used the landline in his study. We arranged to meet the following evening at 7. She'd pack a bag, and we'd drive to Belfast, catch the ferry to Scotland. But you never made it to the meeting point? I went, Sean insisted, his voice hardening. I waited until nearly midnight. She never came. Claire sat back, trying to reconcile these conflicting accounts. So either Eliza is lying in her letters, or you're lying to me now. Sean's face paled. What exactly did her letters say? Claire hesitated, then decided full disclosure was her only path forward. She wrote that she waited for 3 hours in the rain, that you never showed up, that she assumed someone had gotten to you too, or told you lies about her. Her final letter was sent from Boston 6 months later, saying she understood your family's desire for revenge had been stronger than your love for her. Sean's expression shifted from shock to confusion to a dawning horror. That's impossible, he whispered. She never came to our meeting place, and I never received any letters from Boston. The letters weren't sent to you, Claire explained. I found them hidden beneath the floorboards in our attic, with photographs of you and Eliza. They were addressed to you at an apartment in Belfast, but they'd been opened. Someone intercepted them. My father, Sean concluded, his voice hollow. He must have. Christ, Claire, do you understand what this means? Eliza did try to meet me that night. Something prevented her. A chill ran down Claire's spine. Or someone. Sean stood so abruptly his glass toppled, spilling whiskey across the coffee table. No, don't even think it. My father was many things, but he wouldn't. He broke off, uncertainty flooding his features. Wouldn't what, Sean? Claire pressed. Wouldn't harm a young woman who could potentially connect him to paramilitary funding? Wouldn't eliminate a threat to his freedom, his reputation? Stop it, Sean's voice cracked. You're talking about murder, Claire. My father wasn't capable of that. Are you sure? Claire asked quietly. You just told me our family fortune was built on murder, that your great-grandfather shot Eliza's in the back. Perhaps violence runs in the family. Sean stared at her, stunned by this assessment. For a moment, Claire regretted her harshness, but she needed to break through his denial, to make him face the possible truth. What happened after you left Newcastle? She asked, softening her tone slightly. Sean sank back onto the sofa, suddenly looking exhausted. I began medical school in Dublin. Tried to forget about Newcastle, about the Callahans, about Eliza. My father sold the construction business in pieces over the next few years, moved to Spain with my mother. I came back to visit only for holidays, staying in hotels rather than our old house. And you never questioned Eliza's disappearance further? Never wondered why your accounts of that night differed so drastically? I didn't know our accounts differed, Sean pointed out. I never saw those letters until you found them. I believed what my father told me, that she'd chosen her family over me, that she'd left for America willingly. But James Callahan has doubts, Claire said. He doesn't believe Eliza is in Boston. He thinks something happened to her here in Newcastle. Sean was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. So do I. I've always had doubts, though I tried to bury them. That's why I came back, Claire. Not just to face my past, but to find out what really happened to Eliza. The admission hung between them, altering everything Claire thought she understood about their move to Newcastle. Why didn't you tell me? Why make me believe this was about a fresh start, about your career? Because I was afraid, Sean admitted. Afraid you'd look at me differently if you knew about my past here. Afraid of what we might discover if we started digging. And yes, afraid of what my father might have done. Claire tried to absorb this revelation. Her husband had brought her to Newcastle not for the reasons he'd claimed, but to investigate a 15-year-old disappearance, possibly a murder, that his own father might have committed. Do you think Eliza is dead? She asked bluntly. Sean flinched but held her gaze. I don't know. I've tried researching from afar, looking for records of an Elizabeth Callahan in Boston, marriage announcements, social media profiles. There's nothing. It's as if she vanished completely after leaving Newcastle. Or never left at all, Claire concluded grimly. The implications settled over them both. That Eliza Callahan's body might be somewhere in Newcastle. Perhaps even on the grounds of Blackwater House, where Sean could see it from their bedroom window every day. Eliza's final letter mentioned evidence hidden at Blackwater, Claire reminded him. Evidence of what truly happened all those years ago? Could she have been referring to your father's paramilitary connections? Sean shook his head slowly. I don't think so. That wouldn't have been all those years ago from her perspective in 2008. She must have meant something else, something related to the original feud between our families. Claire remembered a detail from her conversation with James. The day after Richard confronted your father at the golf club, Blackwater House was broken into. James said Richard's office was ransacked, but nothing appeared stolen. What if your father was looking for something specific? The evidence Eliza mentioned? Sean's eyes widened with realization. If there was proof that contradicted our family's version of what happened in 1921, it could rewrite the history of both families, Claire finished, and potentially expose whatever happened to Eliza. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, darkness had fully descended, the lights of Newcastle twinkling below their hillside property. Blackwater House was invisible now, a darker shadow against the night sky. What do we do? Claire asked finally. Sean met her gaze, the weight of 15 years of secrets evident in his eyes. We find the truth. About Eliza, about our family's past, about everything, no matter where it leads. Claire nodded slowly, though uncertainty churned within her. She had come to Newcastle expecting to build a future with Sean. Instead, she found herself excavating his past, with no guarantee of what they might unearth. I need you to promise me something, she said. No more secrets, no more lies. Everything you discover, everything you remember. I need to know all of it. I promise, Sean replied without hesitation. And Claire? I'm sorry for bringing you into this without your knowledge. For not trusting you with the truth from the beginning. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. An unknown number. Claire's finger hovered over the screen, hesitating before answering. Hello? You don't know what you've walked into, love? Margaret Burns' voice warned, cold and filled with a knowledge Claire wasn't prepared for. Your marriage is just the beginning. The truth will ruin everything you thought you knew about Mourne Heights. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. What do you mean? What do you know? Come to my house. Now. Alone. Margaret's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Someone saw you at Blackwater House today, someone who wants those secrets to stay buried. The line went dead. Claire looked up to find Sean watching her, tension evident in every line of his body. Who was that? He asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. Margaret Byrne, Claire replied, rising from her chair. She says someone saw me at Blackwater today, She wants me to come over immediately, alone. Sean stepped toward her, alarm flashing in his eyes. Claire, wait. Margaret Byrne isn't who you think she is. She has her own connection to this story, her own reasons for involving herself. Claire paused at the door, turning back to her husband. What do you mean? Who is she to you? She was my father's secretary, Sean said grimly. For 20 years, if anyone knows what he was truly involved in, what might have happened to Eliza, it's Margaret. Claire felt suddenly cold, remembering Margaret's cryptic warning at the housewarming party, her calculated revelations in the garden. The old woman had been steering Claire's investigation from the beginning, but toward what end? I need to hear what she has to say, Claire decided. Alone, as she asked. Sean's expression darkened with worry. Be careful. If my suspicions about what happened to Eliza are correct, then someone in Newcastle is a murderer. Someone who's successfully hidden their crime for 15 years. Claire met his gaze steadily. Maybe that someone is you, Sean. Have you considered that possibility? The hurt that flashed across his features seemed genuine. I loved Eliza, he said quietly. I would never have harmed her. But I understand why you have doubts. Just promise me you'll be cautious with Margaret. She knows more than she's saying. Claire nodded once, then turned and left the room, her mind racing with possibilities. As she crossed the garden toward the gate that connected their property with Margaret's, she glanced back at their house. Sean stood at the window, watching her go, his silhouette dark against the warm light behind him. For a moment, he reminded her of the figure she'd glimpsed in the window at Blackwater House. Standing in the shadows, keeping vigil over secrets long buried. Claire turned away and continued through the gate, into the darkness that separated her home from Margaret's. The truth waited somewhere ahead, and there was no turning back now,